Imagine you are standing on a cliff, the Atlantic wind pulling at your coat. Before you, against a bruised twilight sky, is a palace. It is carved from Indiana limestone and Italian marble, its windows staring out at the ocean like the vacant eyes of a king in exile. This is Newport, Rhode Island, not the Loire Valley. This is a house that should not exist. It is an act of architectural schizophrenia, a European dream built with American steel and sweat and an absolutely terrifying amount of money. This house, and others like it, were not built as homes. They were built as weapons. They were fortresses in a silent, savage war for something money supposedly cannot buy, a soul. How does an empire built on steam and iron, an empire that dwarfed the United States Treasury, simply evaporate? How does a family name that once meant absolute power become a whisper, a historical footnote attached to a tourist attraction? What kind of ambition, what kind of deep and aching insecurity drives a man to build a 70-room summer cottage? And what happens when the monument you build to enshrine your legacy becomes the very tombstone that marks its end? This is not a story about architecture, not really. It is a story about the ghosts that haunt these halls. It is the story of a dynasty that flew so close to the sun that its wings, heavy with gold, melted away, leaving behind only these beautiful, tragic, and empty shells. This is the story of the Vanderbilts and the cautionary tale of how they built America and then built the palaces that would watch their empire die. Welcome to the Gilded Age, a time when men became gods and then discovered they were still painfully, tragically mortal. To understand the marble, you must first understand the mud. To comprehend the silent, opulent halls of the breakers or the cold grandeur of Marble House, you must go back to a time before them. You must go back to the man who would have hated them, a man who saw such houses not as achievements, but as weaknesses. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, though history would grant him a title far grander than any duke or earl. They called him the Commodore. He was born in 1794 on Staten Island, a son of the 18th century, a rough, unlettered, tobacco-chewing force of nature. He was not a builder of palaces. He was a builder of enterprises. He was a man of motion, of steam, of relentless forward momentum. His world was the grimy deck of a ferry, the shuddering floor of a locomotive, the chaotic floor of the stock exchange. He saw the world not as a place of beauty and art, but as an arena of combat. Business was war, and he was its Napoleon. He began with a single small boat, a periauger, purchased with $100 loan from his mother, and from that splinter of wood he forged an empire. His hands were calloused. His language was coarse. He had no time for the delicate sensibilities of the old New York aristocracy, the Livingstons, the Schuylers, the Beekmans. They were yesterday. They had pedigrees. He had profits. They had manners. He had monopolies. While they were tending to their family trees, he was laying down thousands of miles of railroad track, strangling competitors, and amassing a fortune so vast it was almost an abstraction. He was the personification of the new America, loud, ambitious, and utterly unapologetic. What drove him? It was not a desire for acceptance. The Commodore did not care if he was accepted. He cared if he won. His motivation was the primal, unifying force of all great capitalists, the absolute, unquenchable desire to dominate, to stand atop the hill and know that all the other hills belonged to him. He was haunted not by a tainted family name, but by the specter of his own humble beginnings. He was a man who remembered poverty, and he built a fortress of gold to keep it at bay. He lived his life in a modest house on Washington Place, a simple brick home utterly dwarfed by the palaces his children would later build. To him, that was enough. The money in the bank was the monument. The power he wielded was the legacy. He was wrong. When the Commodore died in 1877, he was the richest man in America. He left the bulk of his fortune, an astonishing $95 million, to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. It was a calculated decision. The Commodore believed in primogeniture, the old aristocratic practice of leaving everything to the eldest male heir to keep the family fortune intact. It was one of his few concessions to the ways of the old world he so despised. In doing so, he planted a seed. He had created a dynasty, but he had failed to impart the one thing that had built it, his own savage hunger. William Henry was a good son. He was a dutiful, capable businessman. He took his father's $95 million and, in just 8 years, doubled it. But he was not the Commodore. He was softer, quieter, more aware of the world outside the boardroom. He felt the sting of social exclusion. He understood that in the intricate social geography of New York, the Vanderbilts were still considered outsiders. They were new money. The name was powerful, yes, but it was not pedigreed. It smelled of the docks, not the drawing room, and it was here that the true catalyst for the architectural explosion entered the story. The motivation of the dynasty began to shift. It was no longer about winning, it was about justifying. The third generation, born into a world of unimaginable privilege, needed to prove they belonged there. Their battle was not for wealth, but for worth. And their chosen champion, their brilliant, ruthless field marshal in this new social war, was a woman named Alva Erskine Smith. Alva was a Southern belle from Mobile, Alabama, whose family had been ruined by the Civil War. She possessed a will of iron, a towering ambition, and a keen understanding that in her world, society was not a game. It was a battlefield. In 1875, she married William Kissam Vanderbilt, one of William Henry's sons. It was not a love match. It was a merger. He had the money. She had the strategy. Together, they would launch an assault on the very heart of American high society. Their target was a formidable one. It was an abstract antagonist, an intangible fortress guarded by one woman, Mrs. Caroline Astor. She was the Queen of New York, the arbiter of who mattered and who did not. Her ballroom, it was said, could hold exactly 400 people. This list, the 400, was the definitive roster of American aristocracy. To be on it was to exist. To be excluded was to be a ghost, no matter how many millions you possessed. The Vanderbilts were not on the list. Alva decided this would not stand. She knew she could not beg her way into Mrs. Astor's world. So she decided to build a world so magnificent, so undeniably splendid, that Mrs. Astor would have to beg her way into it. The war would be fought not with words or weapons, but with stone and mortar. Her battlefield would be the corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street. Her weapon would be a house. The decision to build was not born of a need for shelter. It was an act of aggression. The house at 660 Fifth Avenue was conceived as a stage, a Trojan horse designed to breach the walls of the old guard. Alva Vanderbilt hired the most fashionable and expensive architect of the day, Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. She did not ask for an American house. She asked for a French chateau. This choice was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The American aristocracy, for all its posturing about Republican values, was deeply, secretly enthralled with European nobility. They craved its history, its legitimacy, its effortless grandeur. Alva understood this, By building a perfect Loire Valley chateau in the heart of Manhattan, she was holding up a mirror to their own aspirations. She was saying, "You pretend to be aristocrats, I will be one." The house became known as the Petit Chateau. There was nothing petit about it. It was a fantasy of turrets, gables, and steeply pitched roofs, all carved from pristine Indiana limestone. Its surface was a riot of ornamentation, a deliberate and overwhelming display of wealth. This was not the restrained brownstone of the old New York families. This was loud. It was proud. It was an architectural declaration of independence from the understated tastes of the establishment. The architecture was a direct reflection of Alva's psyche, ambitious, audacious, and utterly convinced of its own superiority. It was an architecture of total control. The interior was even more breathtaking. Alva and Hunt ransacked Europe for treasures. Entire rooms, paneled in ancient oak and hung with priceless tapestries, were purchased from crumbling French chateaux and reassembled by imported artisans. The Grand Hall was a two-story Gothic masterpiece, inspired by the Jacques Coeur house in Bourges. The salon was a delicate confection of white and gold, pure Louis XV. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen ice waterfalls. Every surface was carved, gilded, or draped in velvet. The cost was a staggering $3 million, a sum that could have funded a small war, which, in a sense, it did. The sheer scale of the project was a spectacle in itself. While Alva was building her chateau, her father-in-law, William Henry Vanderbilt, was building his own monumental statement just a few blocks south. Known as the Triple Palaces, it was a massive brownstone complex at 640 Fifth Avenue, designed to house himself and his two daughters. It was a Vanderbilt encampment on the city's most prestigious thoroughfare. Fifth Avenue was becoming Vanderbilt Row. The family was not just moving in, they was colonizing. The great contrast, the beautiful tragic irony at the heart of it all, was the source of the money that paid for these European fantasies. The delicate, gilded paneling of Alva's salon was paid for by the grit and grime of the New York Central Railroad. The refined, aristocratic atmosphere was funded by ruthless stock market manipulations and brutal anti-union tactics. These houses were a desperate attempt to wash the coal dust off the family fortune, to perfume the raw scent of capitalism with the delicate fragrance of aristocracy. They were magnificent lies, told in stone and marble, and Alva's lie was the most magnificent of all. For 2 years, the city watched as her chateau rose from the ground. Society gossiped. The Astors remained aloof. Alva planned her final move. She announced she would host a housewarming party, a masquerade ball, on March 26, 1883. It was to be the most lavish party the city had ever seen. The invitations went out to 1,200 of New York's elite. Everyone who was anyone was invited. Almost everyone. An invitation was not sent to Caroline Astor's daughter, Carrie. When a friend inquired on Carrie's behalf, Alva delivered her checkmate. She feigned surprise. How could she possibly invite Miss Astor, she wondered aloud, when she had never had the honor of being formally called upon by her mother? The trap was set. Mrs. Astor, the Queen, was faced with a terrible choice: suffer the public humiliation of her daughter being excluded from the event of the century, or capitulate. To attend the ball, she would have to first pay a social call on Alva Vanderbilt, an act that would be a public acknowledgement of the Vanderbilts' new status. The Queen blinked. A few days before the ball, a carriage bearing the Astor crest pulled up to 665th Avenue. Mrs. Astor, dressed in her customary black, left her calling card. It was a surrender. The war was over. Alva Vanderbilt had won. The night of the ball was the zenith of the Gilded Age. It was the moment the house fulfilled its destiny. The Petit Chateau was no longer just a building, it was the center of the universe. Fifth Avenue was choked with carriages. Thousands of onlookers gathered just to catch a glimpse of the guests, who arrived in costumes of breathtaking expense and imagination. One woman came as an electric light, with a working bulb powered by a hidden battery. Another was dressed as a hornet. Alva's own sister-in-law came as a peacock, but all eyes were on the hostess. Alva appeared as a Venetian princess from a painting by Cabanel, her costume a masterpiece of satin and pearls. She stood at the top of her grand staircase, greeting her guests, the absolute monarch of the world she had created. The house was alive. Its halls, designed for this very moment, pulsed with music and champagne-fueled laughter. The light from 1,000 candles glinted off diamonds and gilded surfaces, creating a scene of almost hallucinatory splendor. The sensory overload was the point. It was a spectacle designed to overwhelm, to awe, to silence all criticism with its sheer, undeniable magnificence. Mrs. Astor arrived, paid her respects, and in that moment the social geography of New York was redrawn forever. The Vanderbilts were no longer new money. They were the sun around which all other stars now revolved. The victory was total, and it sparked a fire. Having conquered New York, the family set their sights on a new territory, the summer colony of Newport, Rhode Island. What followed was an architectural arms race of staggering proportions. The New York mansions were for the winter social season. Newport was for the summer. It was where the real competition took place. Here, they did not build houses, they built cottages. The word was a quaint euphemism, a little joke among Titans. In 1892, Alva and William K. Vanderbilt, fresh from their New York triumph, unveiled Marble House. If the Petit Chateau was a weapon, Marble House was a victory monument. Designed again by Richard Morris Hunt, it was a temple of white Tuckahoe marble, inspired by the Petit Trianon at Versailles. It cost $11 million, $7 million of which was spent on the marble alone. The interiors were an explosion of gilded bronze, crystal, and mythological frescoes. The gold ballroom was so lavish it was known as the tea room, because visitors were said to weep upon seeing it for the first time. It was a house built not for comfort, but for proclamation. It was a golden cage. Not to be outdone, Alva's brother-in-law, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the serious, responsible head of the family, commissioned his own Newport Palace just down the road. It was called the Breakers. Completed in 1895, it was a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that made Marble House look almost modest. It sat on 13 acres of oceanfront land, a behemoth of limestone and ambition. Its great hall rose 45 feet. Its dining room was paneled with gilded leather. It had platinum wall panels in its morning room because gold was considered too common. This was the Golden Age. The Vanderbilts were the undisputed royalty of an unofficial American aristocracy. Their houses were the stages for a life of unimaginable luxury. An army of servants, often outnumbering the family members in residence, kept these great machines running with silent, flawless precision. The days were filled with yachting, tennis, and formal dinners for 100 guests. The nights were a blur of balls and galas. The houses performed their function perfectly, filtering the world, insulating the family in a cocoon of opulence. But even then, in the midst of the triumph, there were whispers of the emptiness to come. These were not homes, they were museums, and the family members were its first and often loneliest curators. The sheer scale of the rooms dwarfed human intimacy. a whispered secret would echo in the 45-foot-high Great Hall. A family dinner in a room designed for state banquets felt like a gathering of ghosts at an empty table. The laughter of children, if there was any, was swallowed by the cavernous spaces. The houses were built for crowds, for spectacle. When the crowds went home, they were left with a profound, marble-clad silence. The golden cage was beautiful, but it was still a cage. And outside the gilded bars, the world was beginning to change. The abstract antagonist, time itself, was gathering its forces. An era was ending, and the Vanderbilts, secure in their stone fortresses, did not yet hear the approaching footsteps of the 20th century. The first crack in the marble facade was not a financial crash or a social scandal, but the quiet, inexorable march of progress. In 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, establishing a federal income tax. A few years later, a permanent estate tax followed. The very economic ecosystem that had allowed for the creation of such concentrated, untaxed wealth was being dismantled piece by piece. The Gilded Age was bleeding out, and the great houses, with their astronomical maintenance costs, were the first wounds to fester. Then came the personal tragedies, the intimate blows that wealth could not deflect. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the builder of the breakers and the disciplined head of the family, suffered a debilitating stroke in 1896, just a year after his masterpiece was completed. He died 3 years later, at the age of just 55. He had spent a fortune to build his palace by the sea, but he had only one summer to enjoy it. His death left a vacuum of leadership. He was the family's anchor, and without him, the ship began to drift. But the most poignant tragedy unfolded within the gleaming white walls of Marble House. Alva Vanderbilt, having conquered society for herself, now sought to conquer it for her children. Her ambition focused on her daughter, the beautiful and intelligent Consuelo. Alva arranged a marriage for her, not to an American but to a genuine European aristocrat, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. It was the ultimate prize, a union of New World money and Old World title. Consuelo would become a duchess. She would be the mistress of Blenheim Palace, one of England's greatest stately homes. There was only one problem. Consuelo was in love with someone else, and she despised the Duke. She begged her mother not to force the marriage. Alva was unmoved. The wedding, she declared, would proceed. On the morning of the ceremony in 1895, Consuelo wept so hysterically that it was said the mascara ran in black rivers down her face. She was a sacrifice on the altar of her mother's ambition. The marriage was a spectacular social triumph and a profound human disaster. Years later, Consuelo would write of her wedding day, "I spent the morning of my wedding in tears and alone. No one came to me." Marble House, the monument to her mother's victory, had become the prison of her youth. The house had transformed. It was no longer a symbol of triumph. It was a monument to shattered dreams. This thematic shift rippled across the entire Vanderbilt portfolio. The great houses, once vibrant centers of power and influence, began to feel like relics. The parties grew less frequent, the guest lists shorter. A new generation was coming of age, one that had not built these palaces and felt little connection to them. They saw them not as assets, but as burdens. They were white elephants, magnificent, beautiful, and slowly bleeding the family dry. The fall began in earnest. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Alva's ex-husband, was quoted near the end of his life offering a startling confession. "Inherited wealth," he said, "is a real handicap to happiness. It has left me with nothing to hope for, with nothing definite to seek or strive for." The Commodore's relentless drive had been diluted with each passing generation. The fortune, once a single mighty river, was now being divided into dozens of smaller streams. Lavish spending, poor investments, and a world war that shook the foundations of the global economy all took their toll. The empire was not just cracking, it was crumbling to dust. The first to go were the great city palaces, the very symbols of the family's conquest. They stood on what was rapidly becoming the most valuable commercial real estate in the world. They were magnificent, but they were in the way. In 1926, just 43 years after the legendary ball that had crowned Alva Queen, the wrecking ball came for the Petit Chateau. The limestone fortress that had forced the capitulation of Mrs. Astor was unceremoniously demolished to make way for a commercial building. Its brief, glorious life was over. It was a shocking moment, a public execution. One by one, the other mansions on Vanderbilt Row followed. The colossal triple palaces, the home of the family patriarch William Henry, were torn down. The block that had once been a solid wall of Vanderbilt power was transformed into a landscape of department stores and office towers. The stone ghosts of Fifth Avenue were exorcised by the relentless spirit of commerce, the very spirit that had given them life in the first place. It was a dark, historical irony. With the demolition came the great emptying. The treasures that Alva and her contemporaries had so carefully collected were scattered to the winds. Auctions were held, and the public gawked as priceless tapestries, Renaissance furniture, and entire rooms of gilded paneling were sold off to the highest bidder. The souls of the houses were being dissected and sold for parts. It was the ultimate indignity, a dynasty's heirlooms turned into merchandise. The houses were being unmade, their memories erased. But some survived. The Newport cottages, isolated from the commercial pressures of Manhattan, held on. They were too grand to live in, too expensive to maintain, but also somehow too important to destroy. Their salvation came through an ironic transformation. They were reborn, not as private homes, but as public museums. The Preservation Society of Newport County, founded in 1945, began acquiring the properties. The Breakers was leased to the Society in 1948 by Cornelius Vanderbilt II's descendants, and later sold in 1972. Marble House was sold by the family in 1932 and later acquired by the Society in 1963. This new purpose was the final, perfect irony. These houses, which had been designed as the ultimate expressions of exclusivity, fortresses built to keep the public out, were now entirely dependent on that same public for their survival. Today, tourists in shorts and sneakers walk through the gold ballroom where Consuelo Vanderbilt wept. They listen to audio guides in the Great Hall of the Breakers, a space designed to intimidate foreign dignitaries. The palaces built to filter the world now invited in for an admission fee. The stage remains, but the actors are long gone, replaced by an endless procession of curious onlookers. They survived against the odds. While hundreds of other Gilded Age mansions across the country were lost to fire, neglect, or demolition, the Newport cottages were preserved, frozen in time. Their very extravagance, the thing that made them obsolete as homes, was what saved them as historical artifacts. They were too famous, too outrageous to simply disappear. They had become part of the American story, a physical chapter dedicated to a brief, fantastic, and vanished era. Today, the Vanderbilt dynasty as a force in American life is over. The name still resonates, but it evokes history, not power. The great fortune is gone, dispersed over generations. A few of the grand houses remain, meticulously preserved. Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, George Washington Vanderbilt's colossal chateau, thrives as a privately owned tourist destination, a masterclass in adapting a legacy to the modern world. The Newport houses stand as silent, beautiful museums, but the family that built them has faded into the fabric of American life. The most famous living descendant, the journalist Anderson Cooper, is a man known for his own work, his own achievements. He is a testament to the fact that the family's greatest legacy was not its wealth, but the eventual return to the very work ethic the Commodore himself had championed. It is impossible to look at these houses and not think of F. Scott Fitzgerald. The story of the Vanderbilts is the ur-text for The Great Gatsby. They were the original J. Gatsbys, men and women who built colossal houses on a fantasy believing that the sheer weight of their possessions could reshape reality and purchase a dream. For Gatsby, the dream was Daisy. For the Vanderbilts, the dream was legitimacy, a permanent place at the top of a slippery social ladder. And like Gatsby, they discovered that the dream, once achieved, was hollow. The house outlived the party. The magnificent facade concealed a deep and aching loneliness. They stood on their marble terraces, looking out at a green light across the water, and never quite realized that the future they were reaching for was already behind them. What does this story teach us today, in our own gilded age of technological excess and social media posturing? It teaches us that the fundamental human impulse to project an image of success is timeless. The Fifth Avenue mansions were the Instagram feeds of the 19th century. They were carefully curated, impossibly perfect facades designed to inspire envy and signal status. We no longer use limestone and marble to build our public identities. We use pixels and filters. But the psychology is identical. The desperate need to use external symbols, a house, a car, a perfect vacation photo, to validate one's internal worth is a story that never gets old. The Vanderbilts simply did it on a scale that remains, even now, difficult to comprehend. Ultimately, the story of the Vanderbilt houses is a philosophical lesson about the nature of time and ambition. The Commodore, the founder, built an empire of things that moved, ships and trains. His creations were dynamic, forward-looking, and they changed the face of a nation. His descendants, in a desperate search for permanence, tried to convert that dynamic energy into static objects. They tried to turn motion into stone. They built fortresses against change, monuments to the present moment, believing they could stop the clock. But time is a locomotive that cannot be stopped. It plows forward relentlessly, leaving even the grandest palaces to rust on a forgotten siding. The houses remain, but they are no longer symbols of power. They are monuments to the fleeting nature of it. They are beautiful, melancholic warnings about the vanity of human wishes. So the next time you see a picture of the breakers, its stone terraces meeting the endless, indifferent ocean, do not just see a house. See a dream. See a victory and a tragedy. See the spectacular rise and the quiet, inevitable fall of a great American dynasty. See a monument built to last forever, which serves now as a timeless reminder that nothing does. It stands there, a silent sentinel on the coast, a sleeping giant of marble and memory, a house that time decided to forget, but we never should.